Hi, Ron. It's Bruce.
Hi, Bruce. How are
Hi.
you?
Yeah, I just want to let you know I find these very, very informative. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
You too, Eddie. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Oh, yeah, it's my pleasure. Yeah.
Eva, you going to start?
Yes, in just 1 second.
Okay.
Okay. So we're ready to kick off?
Yep.
Great, great. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for attending. Appreciate it, especially on a spring night. Welcome to the GCPE Spring Lecture Series. My name is Eve Barron, and I'm the chair of the Pratt Institute's Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment. And that is an interdisciplinary department made up of 4 related programs in historic preservation, sustainable environmental systems, urban placemaking and management, and city and regional planning. We're practice-oriented. We teach participatory process as the best way to support and advocate for just sustainable neighborhoods and communities. The Spring Lecture Series is an example of the interdisciplinary collaborative dialogue essential to this approach. Each spring, we bring together cross sections of people from fields that include community organizing, policy making, decision makers, labor leaders, advocates to unpack issues and bring forward just solutions. Tonight's panel is the 4th and final in the series, an equitable recovery agenda for New York. And topic tonight is decolonizing the planning and development sector. We're pleased to once again partner with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance to curate and moderate these panels. Tonight's panel has an extra co-sponsor, the Planners Network, an international association of professionals, activists, academics, and students involved in physical, social, economic, and environmental planning in urban and rural areas who promote fundamental change in our political and economic systems. You yourself can become a member of Planners Network and access tons of events, people, resources. Just go to plannersnetwork.org. You can also stay current on progressive topics and contribute yourself as a writer at progressivecity.net. Thank you, Planners Network, for co-sponsoring. And just a quick shout out to Amron Lee, Delaney Morris, and Meredith Tenhoor for additional backstage support tonight. Our distinguished panelists are going to be moderated by Ron Schiffman. Ron Schiffman co-founded the Pratt Institute Center for Community and Environmental Development, which is the Pratt Center for Community Development today. And the Pratt Center is the oldest continuously operated university-based community design and development center in the US. Ron participated in the creation of the country's first community development corporation, the Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation. He served on the New York City Planning Commission from 1990 to 1996. He's an award-winning planner and community development specialist and a lifelong civil rights advocate. And we're very proud that he's Professor Emeritus at GCPE. Eddie Bautista is the Executive Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and he also co-curated the lecture series with Ron, but since he's a panelist, I'll let Ron introduce him. We're proud to claim Eddie, though, among Pratt's City Regional Planning alumni and as a faculty member. And we also proudly claim another panelist tonight, Tiffany Ann Taylor, as a graduate of the planning program. And Tiffany, it's been a pleasure to see your many contributions to the field, and we anticipate many more. So discussions of tonight's topic of decolonization and replacement of systems of oppression with non-extractive regenerative relationships and policies is taking place in many rooms this year. Not enough rooms and not enough houses, so to speak. The fields of urbanism and planning in particular have been responsible for racist and egregious policies that sustained and protected white supremacy, and higher education has been complicit. Moves toward decolonization and anti-racism have animated the review of curriculum among all of the programs within Pratt School of Architecture and the GCPE, as well as operations, hiring, practice, student support, and extracurricular activities. An anti-racism task force of alumni and faculty have been working with the department to co-create the work needed to begin to undo racist legacies and lay the groundwork. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panel tonight. And if you happen to touch on education, that would be quite welcome. So Ron, I'm going to turn it over to you to get the ball rolling. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eve. That was, I'm glad you sort of set the framework of why we're having this discussion. The whole series has been focused on how do we create an equitable recovery agenda for New York at this particular moment in time, when we are beginning to see the end of the pandemic lockdowns, when we're in the midst of escalating our discussions about how we invest in our society by with some new revenue sources coming from the federal government. We're beginning to see the campaign for mayor of the city of New York begin to become more and more animated. And so that we're at a particular moment in time where perhaps change can come about. And the first three sessions tried to address what some of those programmatic areas are that we should be addressing. However, we thought, Eddie and I in particular, when we started designing this series, that it was important to be somewhat introspective, to look at our own roles as planners and architects and what we've done over the years to contribute to the racism and the segregation and the economic disparities that exist in our society. And so it's with that humble idea that we really began looking at how do we take an abolitionist approach and create an abolitionist democracy by really looking at the various different institutions and how they can be dramatically and systemically reformed. And so tonight we want to do that in our own home, in our own house. And I've invited 4 people, including my partner, Eddie Batista, to be panelists. So it's going to be a long evening with 4 participants on the panel and a moderator who never shuts up. But it's important that what I do is introduce them very briefly. You all should have access to their extended bios, but I'll read them briefly or just introduce them briefly all at once now, and then call on them in the order that they're going to be initially presenting. And then hopefully after that initial set of presentations, we'll get into what I expect to be a very animated discussion. The first speaker will be Sean Robin. Sean has his master's in city planning, not from Pratt. He's a planner, a musician, a really creative cultural thinker who grew up in New York and in Pittsburgh. He's worked at the intersection between health and community development. And he actually worked at the Pratt Center in the mid-90s, from about 94 to 2003. He was the founding editor of a magazine at that time called the Indigenous Planning Times, an early publication dedicated to multicultural and transformative visions of community development. And he was an officer for the Indigenous Planning Division of the American Planning Association. He also co-founded the BIPOC Planning Collective in 2020 and serves as a steering committee member for Planners Network. I also want to welcome Planners Network, by the way. It brings back the days when the Pratt Center and Planners Network sponsored a similar series every year in the mid-90s to the early 2000s. The second speaker is somebody I've had the opportunity to participate in classes with, a guy by the name of Jack Travis, a dynamic architect who runs a studio in his own name. And he has worked with a variety of different projects of different sizes and scopes. He's got some great clients, Spike Lee and Wesley Snipes and a number of others. He's also written a book years ago where he highlighted a couple of architects that I actually knew who investigated the role of Black architects in the United States, and it was called African American Architects in Current Practice. He teaches at Pratt, at the Fashion Institute of Technology, and hopefully soon, even though he's in the interior design program at Pratt, hopefully He will be teaching in the GCPE, and we will be teaching together a course next semester. The third speaker is going to be Tiffany Ann Taylor, who's now with the New York City Division of Transportation. She's Deputy Director of Freight Programs, Education and Research for the Freight Mobility Unit at the New York City Department of Transportation. Before that, she worked at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Most of all, she was a great student at Pratt, and somebody that a number of us really have watched with develop and as a professional with a great deal of pride. She holds a BA in government from the College of William and Mary, an MS in City and Regional Planning from Pratt. She's a first-generation American. She's the brainchild. I'm sorry, she's not the brainchild. She is the brain behind the foundation of the Hindsight Conference. And if any of you haven't attended that conference, when it comes up in the fall, make sure you do. It's one of the more exciting conferences of young planners, and particularly planners of color. And the agenda of that conference is really dynamic. She's also co-chair of the American Planning Association's New York chapter of the Diversity Committee. I can go on talking about her. The next person is somebody who I can really call a close friend. Eddie is an award-winning community organizer and urban planner, and a part of one of the more powerful families in the United States. He is active in a number of activities in New York State and New York City as the executive director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. He's played a key role not only in New York City, but throughout the state in conceiving, planning, advocating for, and finally getting a multiple set of legislative agendas through the state legislature that all address just transition to an environmentally just package of legislation to benefit frontline communities. Eddie's work has been, I think, has put New York State in the leadership in the country and is a model for what many people are calling the Green New Deal. So we've got a dynamic panel, and a panel that in very many ways has really exemplified where we have to go and the kind of work that we have to do. And I want to really begin to start with Sean Robin to open up the discussion, and then we'll go from Sean to Jack to Tiffany and then to Eddie. So Sean, take it away.
Thank you, Ron. As Ron said, I worked at the Pratt Center when he was the director of it, and I want to thank Ron for his leadership then and since then. I think what I'm going to be talking about is what I call Indigenous planning, but what some people think of as transformative planning. And for that to work, you need people inside the system at all levels. And when I was working at the Pratt Center, Ron was a commissioner for city planning. He sat on the commission, and I think that's significant. There's sometimes people on the left get this thing about, is it okay to be in the system? And Mel King, one of my mentors, used to say, we're all part of the system. And I think for this to work, you need people, we need our own in the system. And so Ron is someone who stepped up at that point in history, and in other ways, I've seen him in action advising when the Columbia was expanding, and there was a whole discussion with the community board. He was there trying to I won't even get into that. That was a big issue. I want to thank Eve also, who's hosting this as a representative of Planners Network, for inviting me into the steering committee last year, and for hosting some fabulous conferences. It was actually the conference that Eve was part of hosting in 2019 that led to the creation of what's now called the BIPOC Planning Collective. And in other words, there are people that I met and that met each other at that event that later became the core leaders of the BIPOC Planning Collective. So just an example of Eve's work and the importance of having networks like the Planners Network. So thank you both for having me here today. So the other order of business before I launch into my talk is I want to honor and acknowledge, I'm in Manhattan, and so I want to honor and acknowledge that this was once Lenape country. The names of the original peoples were the Lenni Lenape. Their territory included Manhattan, where I'm sitting today, included parts of what's now called Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and there are still descendants living today in those regions who are descended from those people. But I want to acknowledge that this was once their land. I don't know whether to say it's unceded or ceded, depending on how you look at history, so I won't go there. All right, so the outline of my talk, I'm going to talk for about 10, 12 minutes, and I'm going to try and situate what I'm calling Indigenous planning in terms of history. And then I'm going to run through 10 tenets. I'll go through them very quickly, about a minute each. Tenets or values that, for me, embodies what I think of as Indigenous planning. And then I'm going to give 2 examples because it's not just a theory. It's things that are actually have happened. So I'm going to run through 2 examples where I was personally involved. But I think as I describe it, you will recognize that this is not something restricted to 2 examples, but this is a real thing that's been happening. So to talk about decolonizing planning, we have to first acknowledge that there is this thing called settler colonialism. That the United States is a settler colonial nation, along with other Anglo nations that are like Australia. In fact, all of the Americas, in a sense, could be described as settler colonial nations. And today, while we are in a world of neocolonialism, and we are part of a capitalist system that feeds on neocolonial style relationships. So I think I told someone that there would be a panel today on decolonizing planning, and she said, "Are you serious? Are you for real? Are they for real?" And I said, "Well, you have to at least name it before you can even be aware of some of the bigger forces that are at work that you're bumping up against when you do progressive planning." So the root of colonialism was taking of land and of labor. And so I think the way forward always involves issues of land ownership and tenancy, and finding ways to share the land in ways that they're currently not shared today. So the question I want to ask, and it's a rhetorical question, but what I want you to think about it is, how long do you think people have been trying to decolonize planning and development? How long? When do you think that started? And the answer I'll provide is that it's been going on for 400 years. Whenever there was resistance to this structure that we're challenging, that was trying to decolonize. So it was always happening. It's not something that started in 2021. Has it been successful is another debate. But there's been initiatives to not go along with exploitative relationships. And I would argue that this was happening whenever the first settlers came and tried to throw their weight beyond where they had power, they were pushed back. A recent book talked even about the Lenni Lenape in the 1600s and how they didn't, in fact, that the settlers from the different European countries did not have full reign of the territory. They had to get permission, even in the 1600s, whenever they wanted to go from one village to another. So there was a whole network of power relations, and the Lenni Lenape were effectively saying no to the colonization that would eventually encompass most of the United States. So I'm not going to talk about the whole 400 years. I'm going to move to the more like the 60s with some of my examples to the present as I move forward in my presentation. But I just wanted you to think about the fact that resistance didn't begin today, or even with your parents, or even with your grandparents. It began with ancestors challenging things that were inhumane and trying to forge more humane relationships. The abolition movement that's been referenced in the modern push against incarceration references a movement against enslavement, and that happened in the 1800s. So that's over 100 years ago. So I could have asked a similar question: when did abolition planning start? And if you want to talk literally about it, you would look at the abolition movement in the early 1800s or whenever it began. I don't know the full history of when the push. I'm assuming it happened even before the 1800s. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is Indigenous planning and what is it that we should name? What is a name that we should use to talk about decolonizing planning? Now, I've already given you my own name. It's important, I believe, to know what you're for. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, used to say that we have to denounce what is unjust and we have to announce what we're for. And so what I'm for is I call it Indigenous planning. Marie Kennedy, someone who's part of the Planners Network, she calls it transformative community planning. I've heard some members of Planners Network call it 7 generations planning, recognizing that there's a lineage. When you do planning, you shouldn't just think about your own generation, but you have to look grandparents, parents, children, grandchildren, and the unborn ones. So there's different names to talk about this deeper rooted form of planning. Now, I use the word Indigenous planning, not because I have some Indigenous ancestry, but because it was a term in 1990 that came to a group of students of color that I was a part of to talk about planning from within and against. It really already did mean against colonization. I've seen Mahatma Gandhi writing in 1914. He talked about indigenous India. He used that term indigenous. He wasn't a Native American. He was indigenous to the land of India, and he was critiquing imperial rule by Britain. So he was using the word indigenous against endogenous, so to mean from within and sort of rooted. So whenever you talk about, when we talk about Indigenous planning, we meant from within. Ted Hohola, who also uses the term, meant for it to mean planning by Native Americans in Native territory. He's actually since extended the meaning a little bit to even his paradigm of Indigenous planning to talk about planning in places where people have been there for many generations. The idea being that even if you weren't there for thousands of years, if you've been there for several generations, you now have a relationship with that land. So it's not wild to use this term, but I know that the term doesn't work for everyone. As Marie Kennedy put it, it doesn't matter what you call it, it's just that you do it. So I'm going to quickly run through 10 tenets. When we were talking about this in 1990, we said it was a paradigm shift. It was the age of we wanted paradigms to change, and we wanted to critique and propose. So we came up with our ideas. So my current list calls upon up to the year 2021, but it has some items that go from my elders. So the first point is that ordinary people have all the answers. Now this will resonate with the progressive planning. I mean, it's this idea that as a planner, you're not coming in to impose your ideas, but to dialogue and to facilitate and to respect the local knowledge and to assume that any place where you are invited in as a planner, and hopefully you've been invited and not just sent, any place that you've been invited, they are intelligent. They have things to teach you. They know what they want. They may not be able to navigate systems of power. They may not know the vocabulary of urban planning and land use, but there are people in that community that have ideas. As Mel King used to say, he knew an old lady who didn't even own the property she lived in, and she had all kinds of ideas about what to do with the vacant lot that the Boston Housing Authority was going to do something with that she didn't like. Ordinary people have all the answers. Number 2, the people are beautiful already. Now, when I said that as a way of saying people don't want a missionary approach, they don't want a savior figure. If a planner in the 1990s, at least, there was this notion that the planner knew best and was going to come and help and maybe advocate with good intentions, but there was still a tinge of this sort of paternalistic thing. So we said the people are beautiful already, to recognize that not only do they already have wisdom, they already are complete people. They're not waiting to be saved by planning. And when I was a kid, there was the expression black is beautiful, which I think the roots of that. And the Navajo have an expression, to walk in beauty. It's one of their prayers. So this idea of beauty if you come with an open heart, you will see the people are beautiful already. Number three, the work is centered on the well-being of the community and the collective, it can't be measured just by built environment or gross national product. I think it was Julius Nyerere, who's the first president of Free Tanzania, who said that if you have development, the people have to be involved. And so it's not just about putting up a bridge. If no one's going to be able to walk on that bridge, then that the development is meaningless. So it's about the collective health of people. Community development is also human development. So it's that attention to the well-being of people, the social fabric, the cohesion in the social fabric. And so part of the work of planning is tapping into that social fabric and making sure that the work that we do is strengthening that social fabric, not just making a few people rich or building nice houses for a few individuals, but it's really tending to a relationship, thousands of relationships between people. I mean, not that one person is tending to all that, but the work that we're doing is hoping to fuel healthy relationships. The next one, respect and dignity in the process. So I think I think people of color know what I'm talking about when we talk about the importance of respect, because it's something that we often don't get. And so it's important to name respect and dignity and even reciprocity. I was listening to a talk by Minnie Fullylove the other day on Zoom, and someone asked her, how do you get different cultures to work together? And her response was, how do you meet everybody with respect? So this work of planning has to be built upon creating respectful relationships as in our capacity as planners. The next point has been important. The idea that we live in a polycentric world. I reject this idea that the world is has universal objective truth. And this is another way of saying I believe in multiculturalism, that there are many forms of culture in New York City. There are many types of wisdom, and it's not just one. And so planning is always a navigating of differences and understanding what the local culture is and what that vision is locally. So whatever worked for you in Corona, Queens on one project may not work when you go to Bed-Stuy, because it's a different geography, and it's a polycentric city. It's a multicultural city. There are many zones of power and of knowledge, wisdom, and beauty. It's not just one. Now, this is not to say that there aren't citywide and national and international agendas that radical planners, indigenous planners, transformative planners can have, but it is saying that there's an importance to valuing that the local is different. But I can also give examples at the national level. One I think there was a recent when Amazon, this may not sound like indigenous planning, but when Amazon wanted to take land in Long Island City, doesn't that sound very colonialist? They wanted to do it on their terms. Now this was a more than local. This was a citywide thing, even though the land was going to be in Long Island City. They did not want to go through ULURP. They did not want to be required to disclose all agreements about the tax breaks they were getting. So from an indigenous planning point of view, this was closing off dialogue, closing off the ability for even the community board to have a say and to evaluate aspects of the plan. So to me, it was a citywide decision or victory that they decided to walk away because they weren't willing to meet the terms. So I just bring that example up to say that when I say that we live in a multi-centered world, there are moments where, as a city, things happen that matter to the local. So that it mattered to the local Long Island City community, what the mayor was dealing, what the governor was dealing, etc. Next point, developing a sense of belonging. So Marie Kennedy has said that success should be measured in terms of increasing the number of confident, competent, cooperative, and purposeful community members. And for her, success in transformative planning is movement towards realizing values of equity and inclusion. and she was saying this in the early 90s. And I think equity and inclusion has fortunately become even more talked about and more central in the nonprofit and government community today. So I would extend her words to say that it is important that community members have a sense of belonging, have a sense of voice, and have a political and cultural and meaningful political and cultural engagement with the land, with the cosmos, with the collective. So this is the opposite of feelings of alienation and exclusion. So planning can play a role in the sense that if you do true participatory planning, or what I'm calling indigenous planning, local people are engaging with the political system, and that adds to their sense of belonging to the political system. Next point, mental health and health in general. When I went to planning school, we didn't study public health. But again, I'm going to reference Minnie Foley-Love, because she did a great job in showing how mental health of the Black community was negatively impacted by planning decisions, namely urban renewal. So there's a relationship between planning and health. And I think that and now with COVID, I think it's been even clearer the inequalities that in planning, that planning helped set the stage for, that led to the adverse outcomes among communities of color. So I'm just throwing it out there without really developing it too fully, that planners, including indigenous planners, are starting to understand that health and mental health are tied to land use. Issues of segregation and desegregation have impacts on health. And I think Minnie would go on to say that when you created root shock by displacing African Americans, it didn't just hurt the Black community, it ripples into the whole social body. So we are all interconnected. She talks about the city as a nervous system. So if you pull out a piece of the nervous system, the whole body is screaming. So anyway, my next point is organizing for community power. Now, I don't think I need to tell a Pratt audience that there's such a thing as community power, and that sometimes the community needs to organize to assert it. But it just needs to be on the list. I will give one quick example. There's a new Bronx-wide People's Platform, and this came out of a lot of nonprofits in the Bronx that have been around for decades coming together, and they're putting together a political agenda. And this is really organizing for community power, and it's a part of transformative planning. Transformation happens when you have access and when you can influence the levers of power. I believe each person has power, but community organizing means that the community is pushing at the larger political structures in the private sector and in the government sector. So the Bronx example, this Bronx-wide People's Forum, I'm going to read one thing that they wrote. They believe in economic democracy, and they talk about fighting against bad landlords, bad development, and bad policies that have not been sufficient to help address generational poverty in our borough or address the deep-rooted inequality we experience here in the Bronx. So creating shared wealth, community control, and ownership over our community assets is critical for us to have a long-lasting impact for our communities. So they're bringing up economic justice and wealth generation, which is another part of planning. So I've got two more items, and then I'll move to my examples. So this one's a little more esoteric. If you haven't felt this yet, this one really is esoteric for some of you. But body knowledge and felt knowledge and dancing knowledge may have something to do with planning as well. Now, I'm drawing here from the work of Laura Harjo, a Muskogee planner who from Oklahoma, and she's written a great book called Spiral to the Stars that I highly recommend. But basically, the short version is, I think when I went to planning school, we had to present a dissertation in writing, but we were allowed to present a video as well. So there was already a recognition of other modalities of knowledge, that a video can have knowledge. So I think what Laura is saying is that there's a body knowledge too, that people have feelings that somehow can be translated into planning. And I'm not going to develop this idea much further, but I just wanted to put a placeholder. My own master's research actually was called Performance as a Means of Youth Empowerment. And I looked at how youth in Boston were using dance and hip hop and rap to sort of develop a sense of community, and it was seen as an urban planning initiative. One last example there's an annual hip hop for mental health workshop that takes place at this mental health conference. So it's linking the dance with well-being. And I think it's not something that planners have yet fully integrated, but I think it's something to think about for the future. Last but not least, and it's only last because I think it's assumed, but democracy. We are for democracy, and I think participatory planning was already pushing this idea of democratizing planning. What I think where we are today with Indigenous planning is sort of participatory planning on steroids. I think with the era of participatory planning, there was this idea that you can advocate for someone else in the spheres of power. You could go to the Department of City Planning and say, I represent East New York because I had a town hall and I talked to some people in East New York and this is what they're saying. I think the next level is that city planning and government officials are meeting directly with people from East New York. And I think we're already almost there, but I just want to mention democracy and participatory planning as part of this radical vision of transformative planning. And I think we're already there. So 2 quick examples I want to give. So I did work at the Pratt Center, and I did I was about to say participatory planning. I did an Indigenous planning process that was, yes, participatory. The way I went about it, I didn't say I'm an Indigenous planner, but I said I need to understand what East New York wants. And so how do I get there? By convening residents from East New York. So I did a couple of workshops. I worked with East New York Urban Youth Corps. I met with the community board. I met with one of the daycare centers. I met with a homeless provider, Help USA. And I brought them, I had different forums. I asked them to bring youth. And it was an open-ended process to understand how do we envision the future of East New York. And I went in, because I wasn't from East New York. I'd never even been there before I was hired by Pratt. So I wanted them to articulate their vision. And I was going to serve as the facilitator for creating that voice. So that process yielded a notion that the best thing they could work on that particular year was the community gardens that were at risk of being turned into housing development. And so it was Indigenous planning in the sense that it came from within, not Indigenous people, but it came from people who were born and raised or who worked in East New York, articulating an issue. The issue was we want to save gardens because we don't only need housing, and we're not particularly confident that whatever housing comes now that East New York is getting hot is going to serve us anyway. So we want to save our gardens. And B, we want a farmer's market. At that point, there was no farmer's market. So my role was done, and it became a technical process of the leadership that emerged to continue to work to create a land bank to save the community gardens, and then to find a property, get funding, work with Cornell Cooperative Extension, etc. So it only after that envisioning and the community giving voice did it move into the technical mode, and they did it. They created the community garden, the farmers market rather, and I'm told it's one of the best. It's one of the oldest and one of the most thriving in the city today. So it's very local level, but it is an example. One last quick example. The Bipod Planning Collective is something that I've started. This is national. It's still in its infancy, so I can't boast about great things we've done. But I did want to flag something important, which is that one of the things that I think that's come out of the BIPOC Planning Collective, it's basically planners of color who work in the nonprofit sector or the government sector, and there are some and white allies. And one of the things that we've had to deal with is the fact that there's a lot of racism and in the nonprofit sector. Guess what? New York City, California, some of the most liberal parts of the country, there is still an unconscious form of racism. I think what Ron was talking about earlier was fighting the good fight at the Pratt Center and at Pratt to address that. We are encountering it as practitioners in the way in which people, staff of color are passed over for promotions, etc. And I've come to believe that if you have a nonprofit that has not stated that one of your goals is to eradicate racism and to work towards being anti-racist, then it's likely that the staff of color aren't going to feel safe to even address feelings of where they may feel there's been an incident of racism. And to be honest, the mark of oppression is such that it's not always clear whether something was intentionally racist or not. And so there needs to be dialogue, etc., to move forward as a society. I think we haven't mentioned George Floyd's name today, but I think that the George Floyd murder really helped start this conversation at the level of at all of the levels of society. So I think that's
Go on to the next speaker. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Travis, are you around?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
For those of you who've tuned in late, Jack Travis is going to present his pedagogy to practice.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to make a case for the importance of design and design aesthetic in the role of decolonizing planning in the development sector. I also want to make a case for the full spectrum of design disciplines, from urban planning and placemaking through architecture and all the way to interior design. As Sean said, the importance of this integral approach, this participatory progressive planning strategy, has to include the stakeholders as well as the creatives and the policymakers. But I posit that it really has to include all the levels of design, including the interiors person. What makes great buildings? I wrote this about 12 years ago when I was asked to come down to the University of Miami at the behest of Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg, who are two very, very important planners of the late 80s and into the late 1990s, early 2000s. And it's about the look of our cities. It's about the aesthetic quality of the differences throughout our regions and how our cities could be impacted if we were more equitable, if we were more open. So what would a Miami look like? What would a San Diego look like? How about San Francisco at this time? And if 50% or more of the planners and the thinkers and the designers and policymakers were women, what would our cities be like? Well, they'd be incredibly different. They'd be extremely regional, and they'd be more equitable. But I want to warn you as I go through these slides very quickly, and there's a lot of text, so you won't be able to read everything. It's always a difficulty in telling the truth. Someone told me once that only babies and comedians can tell the truth, and I'm neither, so pray for me. I wrote this in part of the book that Ron Schiffman mentioned that I wrote in 1992, which exhibited 35 Black architects nationwide. And I'm not a writer, I'm going to be very upfront with you, but I did that book because there wasn't a book for me. And one of the things I did find out is that I'm not a writer, but in doing that book and looking at the depth of the richness of all these Black architects that are out here in the United States, I felt like the more that I actually looked into the problem, the more and more, the deeper, I should say, the problem got. So I'm going to go right at the apex. This notion of excellence that we have in Western society has to be challenged. And I believe that it's a Western phenomenon. And the idea of excellence will change as we're more inclusive, particularly as women are more invited into the upper echelons of the power structure. Often we talk about the perfect, the ideal, but I would posit that in housing and in urban planning in general, we often are left at the first stage is what is feasible? Because there's so much resistance, and a lot of that resistance, as you heard earlier, really has to do with our racism in this country, systemic racism. So then we go from feasibility to actual, and actual is a lot less often, particularly for people of color or who are at risk, than most of us would like to assume. And for me, it starts with academia, because academia is the bed of praxis. In academia, with pedagogy, focusing on the idea of Western excellence, you don't have many atmospheres, you don't have many places in design studios where people who are not white male can actually exist with their ideas comfortably. And you don't have the perspectives for people who can change those atmospheres because you don't have enough people in place who are not white male. And this is really kind of our beginning. We call ourselves problem solvers. And I posit that oftentimes we don't go deep enough to where the problem actually begins. So I want to start with these three gentlemen, and I've never met either of these three gentlemen. I know of their work, but I know that they don't include me in the history of design. Whether it's architecture and the meaning of Western architecture, of which only the first 40 pages have to do with Egyptian architecture, and from that point on, nothing else about people of color in architecture, or the last 100 years of interior design, where there's not a single page that mentions anybody who is Black in the book. And up until recently, MoMA, when Arthur Drexler was head of it, when I first came to New York in 1980, there was talk of Jean-Michel Basquiat being one of the first Blacks to ever get into the museum, and there was no discussion at that point. Glad to say now that there's a lot more focus and discussion on that point. But 50-something years ago, I think Whitney M. Young said it. And this was again in 1968 at the first AIA National Convention in Portland, where they had a Black keynote speaker. We are a proud people, but our sin is the sin of omission and not commission. We are a racist society, and we have to know this, and we don't, right? And within that racist society, there are elements of excellence that cannot be as excellent across the board for equity because they are exclusive of the ideas and attitudes and even body language, as Sean said earlier, of other people, particularly people of color and women. And then you say to yourself, well, is it me? Maybe I should try harder. Maybe I'm a little too sensitive. And then you read that there are others who think exactly like you, and not just a few, but many, many more. Craig Wilkins, who is an architect, won an award for this simple writing. Dear architecture, why have not you included me? And so again, you know it's not just you. And when you start to go out to the professional associations, you come up to these Negro moments, as I call them, right? Where you're the first one of a few, the only one. And that doesn't stop even in 2021, I find, right? And you can't tell people how difficult it is because people can't vision how difficult that might be for you. And I think women feel this in corporate rooms, when oftentimes they know they're the smartest one in the room, and they get no respect in the room at all. And it happens at the very top of who we are as people of color, particularly Black people. Our stars feel it. And then you know that it's deep and there's something systemic about it. And back to Whitney M. Young, he says it. We have to look deeper. And if we want to know what the root cause is, we have to go and find that, and we have to espouse that. And once we know that, then we can maybe move forward. And I think we're sort of at the cusp of an awakening on that after the George Floyd murder, but we'll see what happens, right? So getting back to the end of that, what makes great buildings? We do not have this kind of America, and I think we know this, right? And then until we do, we won't have an equitable society. And until we do, urban planning placemakers and designers, we're not going to be able to really forge a new way of thinking, a progressive way, an indigenous way, as Sean talked about. So what is the problem? The problem is that we exist as designers in an enclave, in a social construct that is exclusive by nature, by beginning, by origin, and has to be brought back to that origin and uprooted from that origin and brought forward. The great things and also the things that are challenges to the idea of equity. And when we do that, as designers and creatives, we can then start to chart and navigate an equitable society. So what do? I write about it. This is the book that Ron talked about. And in my own practice, we try to do narrative or storyboards to let our clients know where our vision comes from. What you're looking at now is a storyboard for a project for a fitness center in Harlem. This is another storyboard for a project which I was design consultant, cultural design consultant on with a large corporate firm, HOK, to do Harlem Hospital. And the board is about destinations. It's about the 3 destinations that we come from and the 15 destinations that we've impacted in the new world since we've come from those 3. And that's going to be the narrative for the design of the entire building, the envelope, skin, the architecture in general, and the interior design elements and details and finishes. And so I want to end with just talking about how I craft my studios, because that's what Ron wanted me to talk about. How do I go about the pedagogy of changing the mindsets for a better equitable student and design? So I teach design studio, as he said, at Pratt in the interior program, but I'm also at 3 other schools. I teach at 4 of the 6 interior design programs in New York City. So Pratt Institute, Fashion Institute of Technology, School of Visual Arts, and New York School of Interior Design. The other 2 are New York Institute of Technology on Long Island, and of course, Parsons School of Design. And I collaborate oftentimes with other professors at both of those institutions as well. So even though I have 2 architectural backgrounds, the focus for me has been really interiors, where I think the most transformation in environmental design disciplines can actually happen towards more equity, and particularly what I call a Black aesthetic. So here you see a series of aspects that we focus on in my studio for at-risk communities. So sometimes the projects are on health, sometimes finance and resource, nutrition, empowerment, youth, focus, and then productive collisions where gentrifiers and locals can actually come together. There are around 8 different aspects, as you see there on the left. Won't have time to go into them. Students are assigned to do field study without me on their own. I have seniors, an undergraduate, and then I have second semester graduate students. So my students are mature, seasoned, and I allow them to go out often in these communities without me. And these are at-risk communities: Brownsville, Crown Heights, Harlem, and they do their own research day and night. I take my students to Philadelphia. I get them out of one enclave, one city, and take them to another city, but we go to at-risk communities as well. We also meet very, very important people in the fight and struggle for a more equitable society. Denise Scott Brown from VSBA, Venturi Scott Brown Associates, is one of the people that we meet with, and the great Lily Ye. If you don't know Lily Ye, you should write that name down and just Google the barefoot artist. And a most incredible human being when it comes to, again, environmental design from an artist perspective, which tells me that artists and designers really need to have more of a collaborative as we move to policymakers and connect with people in government, et cetera, and then the people who are stakeholders in the community. Lily Ye is fantastic. Students sometimes do a charrette. This particular charrette was last year, 2 years ago before COVID-19, with the Jefferson University students down in Philadelphia as well. The way the studio starts out, the students have to look within themselves. They ask the question, who am I? And many of our students, as you know, are from overseas, and they have to bring in their own cultural identity into the mix. And then they find ways to connect that to an African culture, which is something, again, that they're not going to get in virtually any other studio at the great Pratt. We are perennially #1 interior design program in the country. And yet, again, this is something that's remiss. So if the students from China, I want them to write in Chinese calligraphy as well as English. If they're from South America, I want them to write in Portuguese or in Spanish and bring that through. And then go back and find out from their parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts and friends who know maybe more about the culture and identity of the culture that they're from that many of them don't. And then to bring that and infuse that into our project. And in the end, it becomes this fusion of identity. And the students are asked to do collages and to try and to figure out with writing and text and course readings to understand a connection between the idea of cultural identity and design and aesthetic appropriation. Students are also given a number of artists, very famous Western artists, which they know oftentimes, and then Black or Hispanic artists, depending on the project that they're focusing on, that they don't know. And here's a list that I've put together of artists who amazingly have similar kind of ideas or attitudes or visions towards design. And then the students have to compare and contrast between these two. So Picasso, Jean-Michel Basquiat, or De Stijl in The Belly. In a Hispanic, it's Picasso or Lee Quinones. And the students, again, they learn a number of artists through each other, even though they're only selecting one. And it builds, again, a body of other knowledge for them. One year, we actually did Black artists and Black activists. And I think that activists was very important that semester. We were looking at economy and appropriation of 125th Street for a small business incubator. And the idea of activists and the kind of people that Sean and Eddie and Tiffany are, I thought was very, very important. So, you know, with the Betty Saar, you look at Angela Davis. And with Faith Ringgold, you look at Fannie Lou Hamer. Well, these are people they've never heard of before. And then they find out just how important these activists is in the idea and connection to design or to spatial appropriation and identity. And so here you see one of the boards that the students come up with. The student would have done about 5 or 6 boards to show Julie Mehtaru and Jackson Pollock and the kind of work that they do, and then the differences between the work. For instance, one of the biggest differences here is depth, spatial identity in terms of depth of 3-dimensional scale and 2-dimensional platform. And so that's the kind of thing that they understand, and they understand again that people of color are operating intellectually at this level. At the end of the semester, the students do a cultural primer, which is a compilation of all of their process and their research. These books are about 600 pages in total. The students are doing about 120 pages of process through 3 different projects, and then about 200 pages of actual research in 5 different categories, as you see there. And so I asked the students to think spatially from 2-dimensional planning in an other sort of sense. This is a hotel that you see here, proposal for Basie's, a jazz hotel for Harlem. And here is her storyboard and one of the plans for her upper level in the hotel. This current group, and we're presenting tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. And for any of you who want to come in and listen to the presentation of this particular studio that I have, we're looking at students who are doing work at for a cultural dance academy, Ifitayo. It's a real client. We're working with teenagers as end users, and the teenagers hopefully will be there in group, and the teenagers will be our reviewers, as well as the elders, their parents. And then there'll be 2 professional reviewers and 2 to 3 students to each of 4 breakout rooms. So if you want, I can give you the link, and anybody is invited from 10 o'clock in the morning tomorrow until 2 o'clock in the evening. But you see here that this one student who will be presenting tomorrow, he took the idea of Kuba cloth, and he wanted to figure out a way to make a structural wall that could not be removed in this 5,000 square foot space culturally significant, because people would have to come in contact in that space with this wall that ran incredibly through the center of the space. And so the idea was to take the Kuba cloth and to extract from it and to sort of give it a geometric sort of sense, and to appropriate not only a vision for it, but an actual functional use for it. And this is one of the sketches that he'll present tomorrow for his proposal for that wall. Ultimately, it is really about the sensing of space. And sometimes that space is more minimalist, more westernized with color, texture, and pattern that speaks of another, as you see on the left. And then sometimes the clients want that space stressed, and they want it to feel really like another. And so this idea of pattern and culture becomes intense. And I would posit again that the intense use of color, pattern, texture is definitely an African thing and missed in most Western societies. Students also look at history. So mid-century modern, the Joseph Eichler house, and the idea that Eichler was one of the first developers to include people of color in his housing tracts. Very important. And then lastly, we talk about architecture and form, even with interior designers. So again, they think outside the box. Architecture and form is very important. Can't get into it now, but I have many, many ideas about how form is important and maybe gone too far in architecture schools today, but still has to be addressed. And I feel like a lot of young Black architects are not addressing architecture. They're addressing the ideas and the problems behind it, but they're not producing. And the question is, how do we get them to produce so that there's a vision of other in the form itself? But then we take it all the way to furniture. And here is a storyboard and a template by a French male student who's looking at doing a chair for a child to play African drum sitting on, a custom designed chair, and you see the template of the chair, and then you see the actual chair made, and the student actually made the chair at quarter size for the studio. And then to get them in front of as many people of color for their final presentations as I can throughout the semester. So here we are at Harlem Hospital in one of the spaces that I designed with HOK, and the students are presenting mostly, as they will tomorrow, majority of Black architects. We have about 50 Black architects worldwide coming into our presentation tomorrow. And then last, I'm going to finish with this project, a Maasai on Madison Avenue. This was by an Italian male student. I envisioned a Maasai artifact store for Madison Avenue after taking my studio. And what would that actually look like? Visually, it would have to transform Madison Avenue, wouldn't it? And where do you begin to understand and draw roots from the narrative that you want to tell? And how do you take that narrative through structure and through materiality and through planning and through placement and through understanding lighting and beauty, where he took and dissected the entire tribe and all of its aspects and elements, focusing on the people and how the people live to create this space, even through the elements that actually house the actual artifacts. And this is the entrance. So what is the role of the designer? Where Gore Vidal tells us, we're born into the society, and society is a prison. And it's the role of the artist to see outside, to show people a different way. And when that artist does it, it's a good artist. When they stay within, they're not. And so many of our artists and creative people today are within the system because they're not taught from the beginning to look outside. And then Nikki Giovanni reminds us what this is all about. It's not about the brother who looks like me, who had good parents, who's middle class from beginning, who's successful in architecture. It's about those brothers who are creative on the street that are wasting away because they don't see a place for them, because they don't look like, they don't act like what society says they should. They have a different view and a different perspective. And there are millions of them, and they are creative. And the question is, how do we make it happen? Well, the time is now, but we have to be careful. And Derek Bell reminds us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jack. Thank you very much. Could you post on the chat the link for the series tomorrow? Because I think there were a number of requests for that.
Sure, I'll do that.
Tiffany.
Hi, everyone.
Back to follow, but
yeah, I don't know about anybody else that's attending this evening, but I've already just sat through 2 courses. And this is really incredible, and I'm even more appreciative of being invited, given this amazing, just amazing opportunity to share with others. And it's interesting because this is the first time that I've been introduced to both Jack and Sean. Eddie I've met before, but in what I'm going to talk about, you'll actually hear very common themes, but just perhaps from a very different perspective. So I think, so one, I want to start with just a short correction. So when Ron read through my bio, I was formerly one of the co-chairs of the local New York Metro Chapter APA's Diversity Committee. Many of you know it as DivCom, for 5 years. But as of January of this year, I'm actually now chapter president. And with that, I am the first Black woman to serve in that position for the chapter. And I think it's important for me to mention that, given one of the things that Sean talked about earlier, which was creating change and working within a system. So you'll hear much more of that. I apologize, I don't have any visuals, but I promise you that this will be an interesting conversation. If any of you, which I'm looking at the attendance list, many of you have been to Hindsight before, you'll know that it's typically, which I'll explain more about Hindsight in a little bit, but at the end of it, I typically close out the show, so to speak. And I usually give a list of about 10 or so things that I've learned from planning Hindsight for that year. And that's the format that I'm going to take this evening. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got to where I am professionally and what that experience, especially as a Black woman, has been like for me, and how that translates into the topic that we're talking about this evening and what my role has been. So one of the things that I really loved about both Sean and Jack's presentation was that there was an acknowledgement of history, and there was storytelling, and both from their individual perspectives, but also world history, right? And I feel that sometimes as an urban planner, especially someone who works directly in city government, we don't get the opportunity to acknowledge history, or sometimes it's decided that we don't get to acknowledge history. So I want to talk a little bit about my history and then move forward. So I am a transportation planner, and I have primarily worked in passenger transportation. For the last 2 years, I've worked in freight, and it's been a really interesting experience. I knew coming into planning as a profession that for the most part, I would probably be of many categories of minorities. And that continues to be the case in much of my profession. Actually, right now in the unit that I'm in, it's actually the most diverse unit that I've ever worked in, including my manager, who actually is a Black woman. And so my journey, while I've had the opportunity to work on some really interesting and insightful and impressive projects, both through economic development with the city and via transportation, and then more directly in transportation, specifically in freight, it's been an interesting ride. So while it's been a great opportunity to get that experience and to work on really impressive projects, I've also, and even on Long Island as well, in Suffolk County, I've also worked in, unfortunately, incredibly toxic work environments. And however you wanna slice the word toxicity, I've probably experienced it. If it ends in ism, I've probably experienced it. And then oftentimes I didn't even realize it was happening to me at the time. And so I wanted to share that because I think it's important that folks recognize that within our the systems in which we work in, and that it's not your feelings as you experience these things are valid and real, and it's not only you sometimes that it happens to. And I think it's important because as I went through much of my career, I would say, I know I always advanced, but I didn't always necessarily feel empowered as I advanced. And I think because of many toxic work environment, I didn't feel empowered until I got to a certain, essentially a watershed moment that I'm going to talk about. So I want to focus most of the conversation around the Hindsight Conference, what it is, why it's important, how it came to be, and then I wanted to run through essentially like my list of 10 things or so related to that. So why I shared about, dealing with toxic work environments and not feeling represented, not only just as a planner, but specifically a transportation planner, is where we come to the story about Hindsight. So in 2017, I was working for the city's economic development corporation, and I went, like most planners do, I went to the National Planning Conference. That year it happened to be in New York City. It was held at the Javits Center. This was May. And, I really didn't want to go. I went because my employer was paying for me to go, and I figured, why not? And, I think every year the topics always seem really juicy on paper and really interesting. And you think like, this is the year that the presentation is going to be just as juicy. And unfortunately it wasn't. And, I think one of the things that threw me off the most was the fact that Javits is on the west side of Manhattan. And the second I walked in the door, I was instantly one of very few Black people walking around. I was one of very few young people or early professionals walking around. And that struck me, although I had been to other planning, NPCs before. But for some strange reason, I think specifically because it was in, Midtown Manhattan, essentially, that experience stung even more, because I said to myself, I could just walk outside and, speak to a hot dog vendor and watch at least 10 other shades walk right past me. How is it that now that I've come inside this building, I feel like I'm an other again? Like, that's very strange. So another thing that I recognized was that I didn't really, and maybe it's just some of the sessions that I chose to go to, but I actually didn't really feel like there was a lot of representation in the presentations being given by women. And, sometimes I think, well, maybe I'm oversensitive, to something, maybe I'm hypersensitive to it, but I have to tell this story because it has never happened before or since, and I think it's a worthwhile experience. So I went into a session that was actually about microlending. It was a series where I think there were planners from around the country who had worked on some like UN initiatives related to microlending. And in my very small understanding of microlending, typically happens in parts of the world where women tend to benefit from that type of system more than men. So I'm expecting there to be some woman on the stage, or at least some woman in some of the photographs that I'm about to see, and that was not the case. And it was really interesting because there was a presenter who got up to talk about his portion of the project. And he said, he started by saying, thank you so much, for the opportunity to present. As you know, at National Planning Conference, sometimes you don't actually know your co-panelists. You're put together because you're talking about a shared topic. So this is the first time I'm meeting them. But I will say that I am shocked that there are no women on this stage. And that being said, moving forward, anytime I am asked to present at an event, I will absolutely inquire about who is sharing the stage with me and demand that there is more representation. And that was a national plan. I've never seen that happen before. I've never before or since, and the entire room erupted in applause. So I knew absolutely that the feeling that I had walking into that building was spot on. So, moving forward, I still took that feeling of like just not being satisfied home with me. And many of you actually who are here who have worked with me in the past know the story. Like, that feeling kind of haunted me for days. And to the point where it's like maybe day 3 or day 4, where I'm just at home and just my now husband, but was boyfriend at the time, was saying, Tiffany, you are basically talking in your sleep about how upset you are about this conference. What are you gonna do about it? Because it's one thing to be angry, but it's one thing to take action. And I just looked at him and instantly I said, I'm gonna put on my own conference. Now, I've never hosted my own conference before. I've never wanted to, I've never had to. And at the time I was a co-chair of the diversity committee, but for some reason with a lightning bolt, that idea came to my brain. So at the time, Giovanni Christie, who was also a proud alum, G and I were co-chairs of the diversity committee. And it's interesting, I sent them a text and I said, I want to talk to you about this idea that I have. Can we meet up? And at the time we worked about a block apart. And she said, hey, I actually can't tonight, but let's chat tomorrow. And I said, okay, no problem. I came down the stairs. I'm now at work. I come down the stairs to the train platform. And I kid you not, the train comes into the station, the doors open, and there's G. And it was like, wait, what? And they were just as shocked as I was. It turns out that we, I guess it was kismet, really. We stood on the platform and I told them, I have this idea. I know it's super, super crazy, but we should host our own conference. And immediately their response was, that's a lot of work, but yes, we're going to do it. And that's really the origin story. And after that, G brought the idea to the rest of diversity committee, and we had a lot of thoughts about what it could look like. So I'll cut some parts out because it is a longer story, but there are some things that I want to hone in on. So what's interesting is by that time, that was May, the first Hindsight conference was actually in November of that same year. If anyone has planned a very large event, especially in New York City, you know that is actually not a lot of time. I knew basically that I wanted my employer to pay for a large amount or at least completely sponsor the conference, because I felt that EDC does so much work in the city in terms of development that they should have a hand in it. And also at the time, I was the only Black female urban planner who worked there. And I brought the idea to the organization's president at the time, and they immediately said, yes, let us know what you need. And then I was really off and running. So what was so important about Hindsight, and this is the part that gets me, because nothing that I think that we did was actually revolutionary, and that's why it's important for you to hear. So we created this conference to make sure that Black and Brown and people who feel othered in other ways were centered. So this year actually will be the 5th year of the Hindsight conference, and for every single year, the keynote has always been people of color, primarily women who are people of color. We always have sessions where we wrote into our request for session proposals that people talk about intersectionality in planning. I'm tired of going to conferences and there's a transportation track and there's a public health track and there's an environmental track. No, talk to me about how transportation and public health intersect. Talk to me about housing and open space intersect. And then also for us, it was more important to see who was on the stage. We can always get the audience to have more diversity depending on who is invited, but how do you make this stage reflective of that? So in the request for session proposals, we actually said, explain to us why your panelists are diverse. Is it, years of tenure in the profession? Is it gender identity? Is it race? Is it geography? You choose for us and let us know why it's important. The vendors, I'm never going to another conference and getting a chicken pesto sandwich from Kosi ever again. I'm tired of that. There are amazing caterers who do amazing work. Especially in New York City, let's go out and find them. Let's go out and support a small business. So every single vendor for the Hindsight conference is typically a small minority and or woman-owned business, period, end of story, no exceptions. We make sure that there's even an honorable mentions page in our program, because we have so many really incredible topics that we want to make sure that other folks are recognized and connections can be formed as well. So what's really interesting about the conference is the first year, G and I were so excited we were going to get 50 people. It was going to be amazing. And we were going to be so thrilled. The first year saw over 400 people attend. I don't know where all those people came from, but I was confident the fire marshal was going to shut us down. And it's grown since then. Last year, it was completely all virtual, and we had over 1,000 people attend. Another thing about the conference is accessibility. So tickets are never more than $50. Last year, we split the ticket prices in half, and there's always a sliding scale. We always ask for volunteers, and usually if cost is still prohibitive, we ask for people to email us. I can't tell you how many times I've admitted a graduating student who is low on funds, or someone who's unemployed, or whatever the reason may be, for free many times, because it was just more important for us to get for people to have access to these conversations. So there's more to the story, but I want to focus on these 10 things, and they intersect with both the storytelling that I told you earlier about my professional experience and also creating and managing hindsight. And I hope that you're able to see the connections. But one of the first things is that you, especially as BIPOC people, need to create spaces that you need. And it's really interesting because you heard that in both what Sean and Jack has said. And it's often, I think, because we're used to having to do that because we aren't represented in certain circles. And so we end up having to create what we need to feel seen. And also we find that we have to create what we need in order to bring our whole selves. For me, when I hear bring your whole self to work, that's a very loaded sentence, no matter how well intended, because many of us don't feel as though it's safe to do so. So sometimes you have to create those safe spaces so you can. Also, I would say ask questions. No matter where you are in your profession, I am a question asker, whether it's about food that I'm eating or a project that I'm signing the invoice for. There are no questions too small. And I realize, especially around vocabulary, and I think especially when it comes to planners, vocabulary can seem so innocent, but it's actually very loaded. What do I mean? For example, when someone says, oh, well, we need to change the direction of, the lighting or whatever on this building because people don't feel safe. Well, what do you mean by safe? And what people are you talking about? And is that the stakeholder group that we should be listening to? I can't tell you how many times I've been in a meeting where I've asked those questions and the 5 people sitting around a table have 5 completely different answers, right? So you should not be afraid to ask the question. There's no question that is too small. I think especially for those who might be earlier in your career, know that everyone has power. Do not, especially if you work for government, don't get stuck in titles and hierarchy. And this was a big one for me, which is why I shared about my journey earlier. Everyone has power. It could be as simple as you are responsible for writing a job description. You are responsible for interviewing interns. You are responsible for putting together a presentation, and you need to make sure that it is completely accessible. There's power in those things. So don't think that because you are the most junior person or your entry-level staff, that you don't have power, because you absolutely do. You just have to figure out how to harness it. Also ask for alternatives, and this is a lot, if you can tell, along the line of doing the work when you're inside of the system. So, ask for alternatives where you can. So I am further along in my career where I can often manage consultant teams, and maybe I need to hire someone who's on retainer, and I'm given, a suite of resumes to review. I can tell you there's been times where I said, nope, I don't want any of these people. They actually all look the same. Don't give me someone with a traffic engineering degree. I want someone with a public policy degree. I want someone who studied social work. I want someone who has public administration. I think that there is a benefit to really creating spaces where there are people who are trained differently, have gone to different schools, who think differently, into just the normal run of show. And so wherever you can inject alternatives or at least question them, you should do that. Be open to other possibilities outside of what you've been taught. And I can't stress this enough. I think when you go, especially as an alum of Pratt, where you're taught to open your mind and you're taught exactly what was mentioned before, that you as a planner, actually, you're not the expert, you're there to help. That when you then bring that mindset into something like public service, it often, they often compete with one another, and many times you'll run into folks who may have been in public service for a long time and will say to you, well, we're not going to do that way because that's not how we typically do it, and we always do things the way that they've been done. I would suggest that you challenge that and don't necessarily accept that, because just because something has always been done a certain way does not at all mean that it is the right way or that it's actually really inclusive. Small changes are just as important as big changes. And this really ties into what I just said about everyone has power. it's incredibly overwhelming to talk about what we're talking about. Just the words on the screen, decolonizing within the profession is so heavy. And it feels, because we're talking about something that is systemic, right? How do we chip away at something like this? I mean, we have seen examples where there has been, opportunities where we've seen a success in one area, and then later on in the day, it's almost been erased by something negative equally happening. Don't get weighed down by that. Small steps are really still important. So you may not be the commissioner making the decisions and signing the check, but maybe you are in charge of interviewing the next set of interns that comes in. That is equally, if not more so, important. Representation is so important. That's actually one of the reasons why I'm here. Well, I was asked by lovely people, so I'm always going to say yes. But any opportunity that someone, especially if it's students, if someone asks me to speak, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to come. I've spoken to middle schoolers, I've spoken to undergrad, high school, graduate. It really doesn't matter. It is so important for me because, especially as a transportation planner, there isn't much representation of Black women doing the work that I do, that it is imperative for me to just be in the room. And that's actually one of the other things that I wanted to say, that for many of us, just doing the work that you do every day, just having the degree is a revolutionary act. It is a revolutionary act for me as a Black woman in this country to be an urban planner, because the system was not designed, A, for me to even go to college, never mind graduate school, and B, for me to be accepted and do work in that field. The first Black person to get a planning degree was like 1960 something, right? So remember that. And so any opportunity that I get to be a representative for people to see themselves or to see other opportunities, especially with children, I absolutely take it. And one of the things that I always say, which I'm going to say now when I do speak, especially if you're a transportation planner, is to remember that your work has generational impact. And that's one thing that I actually don't feel as though I have gotten in like my planning education. And I know other planners have felt that way. Do not disconnect what you are learning in the book from what you're doing in real life as a planner. And in many cases, other urbanists, designers, historic preservationists, architects, etc. Your work is generational. So it's really important to make sure that you are also representing within your field. A couple other things, and then I'll wrap up. Good ideas will haunt you. Like I said, the concept of hindsight, which didn't have a name at the time, haunted me for days. Don't run away from ideas just because they're really big. It was such a good idea. I knew it would not fail because it had unwavering faith for some reason that it needed to be done, even though it was a very large idea and actually quite ridiculous how fast it happened. So if you have a good idea that haunts you, don't be intimidated by it. And also with that, recognize the tools that you already have. There are arguably more tools today. There's a million social media platforms that are free. There's Zoom, no matter how zoomed out you are, and other platforms that are free. Podcasts, most of those to put up are free, are low cost. Websites, I am not a web designer, I do not code, but I bought a Squarespace account and put together a template, and I have a website, and it is not expensive anymore, right? So there are ways to do the big things that you want to do, especially as they haunt you, and just pay attention to the tools that you actually already have to do them. And then the last 2 things I will say is, 1, don't be afraid to ask for help, especially with the big things, because I could not have done any of the years of hindsight by myself without asking for help. And the last thing is, if you don't have experience in something, so what? So what? Jack just told you he's not a writer. He wrote a whole book, right? He just told you he wrote a whole book, you know? I started an entire conference. I'm not an event planner. I have no desire to be an event planner. I just wanted to create a space and give people a platform. So who cares if you don't have the experience, you will figure it out, or you will ask somebody for help to figure it out. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the work you do. And it really is great. I want to turn to my buddy Eddie. You know, Eddie, one of the things that was said is don't run away from good ideas. So I'd like you to pick up on that and let's hear what you've got to say.
Thank you, Ron, and thanks so much to Sean, Jack, and Tiffany. Listen, I'm going to tell you all right now, I'm going to keep my remarks brief because there was all kinds of brilliance and knowledge that's been dropped for the last hour and change. I'm anxious to get to the Q&A, so I'm not going to be the guy getting between y'all and your intellectual version of drinks and an open bar, because this stuff has been amazing. There are a couple of things I do want to say. One is when we first came up with the, can you guys hear me? I'm sorry, I'm having some feedback issues. Okay. When we first came up with the title for tonight's panel, I had a triggering moment because, you know, decolonizing, I mean, for folks, mostly it's a metaphor. For my family, you know, my mother and her side, that whole side of the family, you know, comes from what most people understand is the oldest continuous colony still left in the world, Puerto Rico, right? So when I hear colony, like it's not a far, deep, old construct. Families living it now, you know what I'm saying? But I understood that decolonizing was a metaphor and a rich metaphor for this conversation tonight. So I'm gonna kind of just begin with two metaphors that, well, one that's been running throughout the evening. Ron opened up talking a little bit about Sean and challenging the system in Pratt, and Sean correctly talks about how we're all part. Was it Mel King, the quote about we're all part of the system? I want to tweak that because there's another metaphor that speaks to a point that I think all of us have talked about tonight, and Tiffany powerfully also mentioning systems. You know, there's a quote. I don't know if you all remember the Shawshank Redemption, but there's a quote that came to mind as I'm hearing systems over and over. And there's a moment in the movie where it's a movie set. If y'all haven't seen it, go tonight, because you should, in fact, hang up this webinar right now and go watch it, because it's just but it is a story set in prison, and it's set among a number of lifers and what they go through. And there's a moment when Morgan Freeman, who's like, you know, in for life, and he's there for, you know, he's the veteran, is schooling a young inmate coming in, and this is what he says. He says, I'm telling you, these walls are funny. First you hate them, then you get used to them. Enough time passes, it gets so you depend on them. That's institutionalized. That is what all of us have been talking about tonight, right? It's what Bob Marley in Redemption song says, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. It's when Jack talks about thinking and designing outside the building footprint, that's thinking outside the box. That's emancipating yourself. And that, if you do nothing else in your planning career, that has got to be one of your North Stars. And by the way, I just want to thank Jack for mentioning Basquiat, who most people don't know was also half Puerto Rican. So thank you for raising him, Jack. And I guess the other point I want to make is the issue of is what some of you as planners. So one, don't get institutionalized. If you're at DOT, city planning, you know, the Pratt Center, I don't care where you're at. The minute you start getting institutionalized is the minute you start cutting yourself off from your own creativity and your own accountability to community. I'm assuming that we're all here because this is a Pratt crowd, that there is a progressive vision and set of values that maybe most of us share at heart, right? So that is part of your charge as a planner, right? Is to not give in to becoming institutionalized, because it blunts your growth and ability to channel creativity as a professional. And it also is going to stop you from doing doing God's work, which is being there for communities that, have been fighting for and getting seats at the table, but still need the resources. Because if you're going to dismantle institutionalized racism, it's going to take a minute if it's taking us literally, thousands of years to get here, right? It's going to take some time to get out. Part of it is to not buy into a system that just closes all that off of you, right? The second point I want to make is about assumptions. When you do deal with community, I'm not going to speak about other movements. I will tell you from an environmental justice perspective, if you're dealing in a community and you have the good fortune of running up and we're having to work with an environmental justice organization, do not make assumptions about, do not have what my wife calls deficit-based expectations, right? You understand that in EJ groups across the country, we have planners on staff, we have lawyers on staff. We have chosen to do this work because if we're about liberation work means yes, in the hood too, right? So, do not make those assumptions. And I'm just going to close with this one example. A recent Pratt graduate named Summer Sandoval has been working at Uprose now for a couple of years and was a key player in maybe 6 months ago, a 1-2 punch that the Brooklyn waterfront has not experienced in decades, right? The first was they were fighting a rezoning, and by some calculations, maybe the largest private rezoning application in New York City history, Industry City, coming after 1 million square feet of manufacturing space. Summer Sandoval and Uprose, not only, and this was one of those where everybody was saying, you can't win. There's no way. It's too much money. It's a multinational developer. It's Sunset Park. Not only did they beat Industry City, but 2 to 3 months later, an announcement that the largest assemblage of offshore wind, an offshore wind assembly, the largest on the Eastern Seaboard, is going to be built right next to, in fact, on the footprint they were fighting over. And this is going to create thousands of jobs. It's the first major step in a just transition for New York State. And yeah, this is a decolonized woman of color planner coming from Pratt, working at Uprose, thinking outside the box. This is what is possible, people. And, I just want to say I'm inspired by the work every day. But then I get to hear, Sean, Jack, and Tiffany, and it just is just life affirming confirmation that what a lot of us have been going through is not only common, but challengeable. And I'll stop there because I know we want to get to our great panel. So thank you, Ron.
Okay, I want to thank you all. I think this has been it's a bit longer than we had planned, but I think has been a very moving and very thoughtful set of presentations. I want to invite the audience to submit any of their questions so we can get to some of the audience's questions. But I want to ask each of you in a brief way, how do we take some of the ideas that you put forth? One of greater inclusion, greater use of intersectionality in what we see. The whole concept of, I'll rephrase it, that dare to be dumb, to ask simple questions so that you, I always find that when you ask a simple question, it liberates everybody else to ask the questions and to become engaged in the process. How do we translate those ideas into much more of a professional capacity through education? Because, and Jack, I want to start with you because you have a very, I think, beautiful and systematic approach to letting your students go out and work and experience those that in their direct action with communities. And in many ways, that maybe in not as a structured way, but it's exactly the way we operated at the Pratt Center. That's what Sean explained at the end. He was out working with some students and some others with community groups out in East New York that led to the formation of that, one of the first and one of the more successful community-based farms in the city. But how do you really allow the students, first of all, not to reject who they are? Because I think normal education experiences tend to sanitize students, to take out of them the life they come and their own experiences and their family's experience. How do you really animate the students to do what you really want them to do? And others should think about that as well.
Well, I like to start out with the story when I was in undergraduate school at Arizona State University. And I was there for 3 years, 5-year program in those days. And I remember coming out of studio and I saw my first Black architect. First one ever. I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I hated him. I looked at him and I could not believe what was going through my mind. And why did I hate him? Because he showed me a mirror of what I had lost, what I had forgotten coming from where I came from, and the things that for 3 years I was swallowing, absorbing. A lot of it good, most of it good, but a lot of it not about who I am and where I come from and the power and potential of what I can do. So I didn't say anything to him for, I don't know, if I remember correctly, weeks, if not months. He didn't say anything to me. And one day I was in the corridor and I was walking by his office and I looked in and he looked at me and I said, hello. He said, come on in, right? Because he knew what I was going through and he let me go through it. And when I was ready to look at him and to confront what I was thinking, he said, come on in. And I'll never forget that. That's Russia Glenn Fellows. And Russia was the kind of architect who did all the work in South Phoenix, all the work on the Black side of town. When white architects couldn't go over there, our professors were winning awards for doing branch banks in Phoenix. If you know the Southwest, those were these gems of projects that you could be very, very creative. And our professors were very good. Not one of them was on the South side of Phoenix and not one of them was done by a Black architect. In Russia, he said, you have to understand that I am a good architect. And I listened to him for the next 3 years that I was at school. And by the time I got to graduate school at University of Illinois, it was important for me to allow people to have space. And so when I first started teaching in 1992, I realized how important that was. And so I think if you can have students come in and you can give them a sense of power that they have by allowing them, one, as you said, to go to the clients without you. And that's one of the first things that I say up front to them. You are an adult like I am. I want you to go to the clients. I want you to call manufacturers. I want you to come back with information and challenge me on what I think. Now, I have a wealth of information to give you, but I don't want to saddle you with my wealth. I want to share it, but I want you to bring in. And again, I'm lucky because I teach advanced students and they all get it. They all get it. I have very few problems with students wanting more supervision than I allow them to take leeway on their own. And so when they come back, they can hear a different voice in their head. And I have to learn to respect that voice. Each student is different. I have students who will upfront do the work and come in every week with the work done. Then I have students who think. They may look lazy, but you know that they're thinking and you have to allow them that. And so I see things at the final presentation I've never seen before and students still get A's because I realize that they're all individual and all different because Russia Glenn Fellows, he let me, if he had tried to either ignore me totally or to push me into a situation, he would have lost me. I don't know what would have happened. But the first architect who looked like me that I hated is the reason why I give back so much now and in such a way that I think I try to at least open up for other people to take that charge. But I want you all to come in tomorrow and to see what my students are about and to see how they handle the breakout rooms. They don't need me, which is a good thing to say, but they need me. but they don't need me. And I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. Sean, let me turn to you because I think you started in many ways. And why don't you just pick up on how one really begins to emerge and feel that they have the power within them.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, or I thought you were asking a slightly different question, but I'll make two quick points. I remember when I was a grad student, again, Mel King was one of the professors. He came into the room and he said, "What do you remember about your own child when you were growing up? Who helped you?" And so it was, I think Tiffany talked about a history. Another word for history is memory. So getting students to remember or bring their whole selves into the classroom means evoking their childhood experiences of their parents, their ancestors, and then that's part of the material of what planning is and part of what we're working for. As far as evoking power, I had a similar experience to Tiffany. We organized because we felt left out of the curriculum, and so the student of color group came together as a reaction. So it was really that sense of something's wrong, and my fellow classmates feel something's wrong, so we're going to do something about it.
Let me ask Eddie or Tiffany if you want to comment on what Jack
Sure.
said.
I would agree. It's interesting because Jack hit the nail on the head and said, give people power. I would phrase it as build your confidence outside of your work. And if anyone worked with me in DivCom in particular, that's one of the things that we try to do. We often work with folks who are early professionals or people early in their career. And when we, plan an event or something like that, we will say outright, pick an assignment that you're interested in that you may not get to practice or flex as a muscle in your 9 to 5. Because I think when people can have that sense of freedom that if they make an error or don't get something immediately off the bat, that there is, less at stake for them. When you are a Black or a brown person, especially on the job, there's often, unwritten consequences when you make a mistake. And so you don't feel as though you have the flexibility to show up in the way that you would really want to. I would also say just start the thing. If you want, whether it's in education, for students, whether it's as a professional, I find that it's harder for people to get behind an idea, even if they agree with the idea, unless they can tangibly see how it's manifesting. Where can they see themselves physically fit into support? Sometimes support could be volunteering someone's time. Sometimes support could be writing a check. And both of those things are okay and often needed. And so I think that if you just start, that's also a way to get people to feel empowered or for people to come behind you. And then the last thing that I would say is if you have a type of privilege, perhaps in this instance, specifically white privilege, know that it does not disappear when you speak up or ask for something more. And I think that that is something that folks need to recognize, because I'll often hear, well, I saw this thing and at work or in the classroom and it didn't sit right with me, but I didn't know what to say, or I didn't want to overstep my boundaries, or it felt uncomfortable. It's okay to speak on those things because your privilege is not going anywhere right now. So if you have that opportunity to support someone to speak up against something, ask for something, a different perspective, then you should exercise that.
Yeah. One of the things I learned early on was that when I would come into a class and the class was diverse, that it was better to engage everybody in the class in the discussion, because you had if there were 10 people in the class, there were 10 people that could contribute to the knowledge base of that class. And I think that's something we've got to learn, is really, and Jack, I think, addresses it by saying he's dealing with graduate students. He's dealing with students that are advanced and have certain sets of skills, but people who come from diverse backgrounds add and enrich the dynamic in the classroom. They add considerable amounts from their own experiences. And I think that becomes a major educational tool, and one that we often set aside and don't really engage in. I want to ask the audience, are there any questions? I'm not getting any being sent to me, so I think I might want to do something that was...
The audience is drunk, Ron. Either that or they're just like blown away by the brilliance. And
I think they are. Somebody said, I do have a question if no one else does. Who are you?
Sorry, Ron, it's me.
Okay, go ahead, Ron. What's your question?
Again, if nobody else has one, I'm okay. Something that just came to mind, actually, I guess, in a lot of what we've been talking about with education, especially in thinking about this topic, is still like, what do y'all think that Pratt can do to continue, like my cohort, for example, is really not very diverse, and I don't know. That's just my question. Is like we're having this conversation, and meanwhile I'm in a class with majority white students, so I don't know what the question is, but I don't know.
Well, I think the question is, how do we really attract and support a much more diverse student body, and quite frankly, a more diverse faculty at Pratt? How do we take on that challenge and really meet that challenge?
I think I have a solution, and I think it's actually tried and true, but I think it never is tried, and that's kind of the issue. So I will just posit this. It starts with resources. It doesn't start with energy. It doesn't start with ideas. We have all of those things. Look at this room, right? It starts with resources. 20 years ago, I gave a manifesto to National AIA. I was on the National Diversity Board back in 93, 94, with Cecil Stewart from Nebraska was the president, national president. Great man, great man. He allowed 12 people of color, LGBTQ, Black, white, women, 50%, to form a board and to tell the AIA in 1993 what they needed to do to move towards equity. This was, of course, right after Rodney King, right? And so I came up with, I think, these points. Number one, tell me how much money you have to put towards the solution, because then I can tell you what I need to do. Number two, the timeline that you think it's going to take. If I want more people of color, particularly Black males and females, in interior design, I posit that it's going to take about 30 years. 30 years. And within 30 years, which goes actually fast, you can make a significant dent if every 3 to 5 years you looked at what your goals were and the incremental success for each one of those goals you thought you needed to make. And when you weren't making it, put more resources towards it. In 30 years, you would have a significant number of Black male and female people in the interior design department at Pratt. This is what we don't do. We don't set the resources first. We don't give ourselves a timeline and then check us along that timeline. And then number three, say what we want to accomplish at the end of that time. After 30 years, I'd like to have 10% of the faculty Black and brown. And here's $13 million that I could put into an endowment that we can get $175,000 annually for perpetuity beyond 30 years to actually make that work. There's your formula. And who can do that? See, even after George Floyd and COVID-19, we're having trouble with subject matter like ours getting funding. Let me put it that way, right? And the question for all of us is why? Because if that funding can come through, like for Tesla going to Mars, we wouldn't have these issues.
Eddie?
I'm sorry, Jack just made me think of Gil Scott-Heron and Whitey on the Moon. I'm sorry, I gotta thank Jack for that. That was Listen, are you seriously asking me, Ron, like how my ideas for how I can get a raise to get some more brothers and sisters in the program?
Yes.
If I knew that, there'd be more brothers and sisters in the program. I go with the Jack plan. I'm gonna call it the Jack Travis, Save Pratt Soul plan, SPA, something like that. Yeah.
Well, can I jump in here? I have a slightly different thought, which, yes, to making planning programs diverse, but whoever is there has work. There's work to be done for all. So I think, regardless of lack of students of color, then the education is still. There's issues of class. There's such a thing as the American working class. A lot of the working class is not of color. There's issues of patriarchy and gender, and as I think Jack just said, there's already lots of ex-planners of color who may not be your students, but who students can study. So you can bring the diversity in, and you can also have conversations about what is your place within larger struggles.
I would say to Sean, you're absolutely right. But Sean, all that's happening now. That's all happening now. It's been happening since the 70s. When I first came into school, and I was at Arizona State in Arizona, where we were 13% of the population of Black people was 13%, but the state population was 6%, and we had Black studies. And I took Black studies, right? So people like you and Tiffany, and Eddie and Ron were out here, and we're doing exactly what you said. What's missing is the money, everybody. And I have to tell you, it sounds crass, but we're a capitalist society disguised as a democracy, probably more of a republic going to a fascist state. But what we need to do is to really get the resources in place. Why do you think you have a Getty Foundation? Why do you think you have a Ford Foundation, right? And it's for perpetuity. They're operating on the interest of funds that are in place that are never going to go away. Where is that in any organization that Tiffany has organized? Now, if Tiffany had $15 to $20 million and she was just operating on the interest every year, that 15 or 20 would never go away. And within 30 years, and Tiffany will still be a young, beautiful young lady, she would be able to significantly change this with all the energy that you're talking about that's already existing. That energy is not going to stop because we get the funding. That energy is only going to increase, I think. And you're going to see that if you set timelines and you set increments, you're going to make progress, because that's what corporations do. That's what banks do. And they know how to do it. We don't get it because the focus is still not, I think, where we need it to be as a nation, right? So we problem solve, but we don't deeply problem solve. Because when we do, we can change things.
I would add that all of what we're talking about doesn't exist in a vacuum. All of these things need to happen at once. I think that's really important for people to remember. It's so easy to just say, how do we just do this one thing? How do we just solve recruitment? How do we just solve promotions? No, it's all of these things and then pay people for it. So I have more questions to your question, Ron, because I can't be giving out all the answers. How is Pratt promoting and supporting alumni in their work? That's a great thing. Pratt has a name that people know essentially all over the world, right? How are we lifting alumni of color in particular in their work? Do PhDs need to be required to teach, and why? Should it be from everyone? Can we have, more guest speakers who are maybe alumni, or maybe folks who aren't alumni, but work with other folks in, the Pratt network that is very vast, that could bring in other perspectives? Who does Pratt partner with on events and initiatives and studios? Can we, essentially audit or cross audit at other institutions? This is, the answer to that question would have been very different in 2018, but in 2021, can't we host a joint class or a joint studio with someone at Howard or someone at, another institution? What is stopping us, the collective us, from doing that? And then also, Also scholarships and paid fellowships. Where is that pipeline? Pratt is expensive. I know because I'm still paying that off, right? But when I first entered the field, especially as I've mostly been in the public sector, the pay for what my education costs versus what the city or county government pays me, that does not match. And I know that I don't have to explain at all to this audience or these panelists what the differences in generational wealth looks like for different people. So, to this point about especially additional funding, maybe the money doesn't even come from Pratt, maybe it comes from a partnership, a Ford Foundation, where, it's not just a scholarship, but also we're paying for your room and board or whatever it is that you need your first 2 years out of school. Like, where is the opportunity to be creative and really take the name of the Institute and Pratt Center and really start knocking on doors and asking for funding?
Well, I could go through a litany of events where we did just that. I mean, in the late 60s and early 70s, we actually had a King Fellowship where 40% of our class were people of color. And it ran for 3 years. It's money that, as a director of the Pratt Center, I was able to raise after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And we were able to actually create what was a core of people that were able to get out there and change the world. And unfortunately, those monies ran out. Years later, we started the Pratt Community Economic Development Internship, taking leaders from community-based organizations around the country, around the city rather, and bringing them in and actually giving people master's degrees based on experience working in the communities, not necessarily requiring a bachelor's degree. There weren't many, but we were able to, I think, train about I would guess over the 7 years of that program, close to 140 people in community economic development and planning. They staff many of the community-based organizations in New York and upstate and a number of other places. However, those monies dry up and we're a private institution and it's hard to get these things institutionalized. And I just got a message that one of the members of the Board of Trustees is in the audience, and Bruce Gitlin raised his hand. So Bruce, why don't you help me out and answer the question?
Okay. All right. First of all, I think Tiffany is not up to date with what's going on at Pratt. We now have 25 full scholarships for students of color or Indigenous people. This is pretty new. We have a vice president in charge of diversity and inclusion. And we have a board committee, a full board committee of the same name. We're working on many programs right now, raising money, doing events. And I think you should speak to Nasambi Ricketts, who's the vice president of diversity, equity, inclusion, and bring yourself up to date. Pratt is making major moves in this direction.
I must say, from my perspective, it's a unique and important opportunity at Pratt to be able to do that. We have a president and a dean, both of whom are totally committed to broadening inclusion and raising more money. So a lot of what, Tiffany, you're proposing and that Jack just proposed, I think we have the leadership in those two positions to undertaking that. And as Bruce said, there are many efforts there. I think we've got to go beyond those, though. I think 25 scholarships is a great start, but it's not sufficient, and we have to find the resources. And one of the things I've been talking to Eve Barron about is whether or not we can't figure out a way to go to the Ford Foundation and a number of others to make sure we're making a substantive contribution in the future to continuing what's going on this year, not just doing it in the year after that kind of thing. We're making sure that it is totally institutionalized. So I think it's really important that we get and engage the alumni in that process. I think Jack is on that inclusion committee at Pratt because Eve Barron, I think, proposed him for that position and he was accepted in it. And so we're really trying to work on that effectively. It goes in waves, unfortunately. And I think we have to figure out, how do we make it a steady flow into the professions, because I think it's critically important that we address that issue and address it in a substantive way.
Just to build on that point a little bit, I mean, we've heard repeated themes throughout the night. We've heard intersectionality and we've heard systemic, whether it's racism or other, and part of the problem is, you do have to attack all of it at once, and it's going to take, like right now, how Pratt, 25 scholarships, okay, nobody will turn those down. I'm glad they exist. But that compared to 40% of a class, it's a difference of scale that it's going to take a lot to get there. And if one of the responses, if 50 years ago, Ford and other foundations stepped up because of the time may be there again, right? But even if the foundations themselves are not diverse, you have to cut through this. If the issue of white supremacy and systemic racism is a real and across the board reality, then the places you turn to for salvation are also going to be places that are facing the same challenges. So there have been a number of efforts over the last 10 years. The latest was launched just a couple of months ago, called the Donors of Color Network. But there has been a consistently, and I think growing, series of campaigns to make sure that the foundation, the philanthropic community diversifies. Because if the decisions of what to pilot a multi-million-dollar investment doesn't see race at all, or sees it, again, either from a deficit-based expectation or from purely a numbers diversity, DIE or DIY, whatever. Those acronyms mess with me, folks, I got to tell you. But if that is the goal, then the systemic change that you seek is not, it's a bridge too far. So I just, I don't want to, let anyone off the hook. I think the point is we're all on the hook. If we want to implement the Jack Travis manifesto, which, by the way, Jack, that's what happened to Jerry Maguire. He had that moment and it changed his professional. And it sounds like you had a similar Jerry Maguire. Just anyway, but that's the Jack Travis manifesto.
Yeah, Eddie, but I must say that even before the last 18 months of racial reckoning in this country, we sat down with the president of Pratt, the head of Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation, with Eve and others, to begin to think about how we raise the resources. I want to be able to leave this institution and leave a legacy that would make sure that there will be an ongoing addressing of racial and systemic change in this country. And so we're really looking at ways that we can begin to develop those kinds of scholarship monies. I have also, historically, we worked with, to Tiffany's question, with a number of the historically Black colleges in the 70s. Rudy Bryant and myself were assisting them to develop community outreach and programs. We were actually funded at Pratt to help HBCUs around the country deal with how they can work with their communities around community development. And we were able to get the resources. We were asked to do it and got the resources from HUD to be able to do that for a number of years. And it was a very exciting period of time. We do partner with organizations in the city of New York. The example Eddie gave of Uprose, we have a working relationship with Uprose, which I think is a very important one. It's a great educational opportunity for our students because they're engaged with people on the front line in a community, in a women-led, community of color-led organization that is dynamic. And And one of our graduate students happens to work there, but it's a relationship that's been going on, I think, since 2007 or 2008. We work hand in hand with the Ocean Bay Community Development Corporation in the Rock.
Oh, Ron, just one. I didn't mean to interrupt, but there is another. As Pratt continues to think through and implement, right, like ways of diversifying, faculty and student. There's also like this political. I mean, I don't know how many of y'all saw, Biden's, joint address of Congress. Love Joe, not always the most compelling speaker, but there was a ton of stuff in that speech, including commitment to channeling the sorts of resources towards education, free community college. Like there is an openness in the Biden administration to thinking about the kind of support that HUD used to give for Pratt and HBC. Like I just want to urge the administration, the Biden administration has opened the door to revisit the kind of partnerships that Ron, you've said that it's been hit and miss. It's time to hit again.
I agree. And I think that's one of the things that I'm hoping we'll be able to do in the next couple of months.
And just three things that I'd like to add. Number one, I think something like 1/10% of the population has 36% of the resources. 1% of the population has over 50, maybe even 60% of the resources in this country. So the point being, the resources are here. And the question is, how do we get to them? Number two, I remember hearing before President Trump was elected, Cory Booker sitting down at a luncheon, I believe it was, and he was sat next to Zuckerberg. And he just promptly in discussion asked Zuckerberg for $100 million. And at that luncheon, I was told that he got it. $100 million and just asking for it, right? Because he went to the right source when he had an opportunity. And number three, just recently I heard that RISD just got an endowment for 6 diversity professors in their design department, right? All paid for the next 6 years, I believe. 6 professors paid salaries for 6 years to focus on design and diversity. Where did that money come from? So my point is that we need people who are looking at who can give us money, who can figure out the kind of channels to get the money, because I'm convinced after affirmative action, I was alive and well in the 1960s, and I saw what happened, and I saw it peter out. Ron, you just mentioned, that money 30 years ago petered out. What if it didn't? Where would you be now if that money didn't peter out? But what I think I heard Cory Booker do when he was still in New York, he was still mayor. They took the money and they used it instead of actually setting it up in an endowment and using, again, the interest off the endowment. I'm telling you, we're onto something here. If we can get established money that never goes away, which means this has to be a lot of money, of course, but if you can start that and start spending the interest, it is perpetuity. It's like the Ford Foundation or the Getty. How do they work? I think we need more financiers in our meetings, everybody, because it really starts there. And then it comes to the Seans, and the Tiffanys and the Eddies, and the great Ron.
One of the reasons behind this effort.
God willing.
Bruce, you raised your hand.
I'd like to say one more thing. I don't know if you know it, but I'm chairman of the board of Pratt, and I am personally and professionally committed to make this happen, as is President Bronett. And the whole board is. So what you're saying, Jack, is really true. However, we have a whole new institutional advancement group of people who every day are trying to raise money, and big money. It is not easy. We have people on board now who are only seeing foundations, who are only seeing corporations, who are only going to governments. We're doing everything we can to raise more money, both for things like scholarship, endowed chairs, and the whole being of Pratt, because it takes money. It really takes money, and money, as much as you think it's easy, it's not easy to get. And most of the other schools and places are in touch with people who either graduated from there, who are very successful in business. And Pratt doesn't have many of those kind of people. They're successful, but not the big money people like the Zuckerbergs and the Bezoses. So we are really trying this very hard. So you can all be assured that's going on. Thank you.
Well, to the extent we
Thank you,
can make it
Bruce.
helpful.
If there's any help you could give me with my student loans, I'd like to stop paying them. I'm just kidding. I know it doesn't go to Pratt. I'm just kidding, but thank you, Bruce. Go ahead, Ron, I'm sorry.
Are there any other questions from the audience? There was one from Jared. Was that question covered?
No, I can, here, let me turn on the camera.
Go ahead, Jared.
Everyone, first of all, thank you everyone for the presentations. Eddie, one of the things you mentioned was about how colonial rule is still one present today and very close. And like my mom's side is all from Jamaica, and she grew up in under colonial rule. So it's close, you know, it's we're not as removed. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. But one of the things, everyone on here has different like spaces that they sort of work in, different like, I don't want to say like amounts of power, but different like, yeah, I think you know what I mean in terms of within the system where what you can do. And so what I was wondering was how from outside a lot of people could mobilize and connect and mobilize in ways that one help your efforts in terms of, I know a lot of political change first comes from like cultural changes, and there's a lot of things that we have to do first from the outside that can put pressure that from the inside you can do a lot of changes. So one, what can people do in organizing from outside that can help? But also I suppose what are some ways we can go around about just mobilizing? Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
That's to you, Eddie.
And Jared, thanks for the question. In many ways, that's the question of the moment, right? Like, you know, we're still in a moment as a society where, you know, social movements are just totally either changing things, on the verge of changing things, or threatening to change things, right? And for the good and bad, by the way. Like, movements are not all progressive, movements are not all for justice, right? We've got a pretty nasty, autocratic, fascist, like, it's real, right? But it's a little hard to answer in the abstract, but because it depends on like who the person is, right? I would answer that question differently. I think, in fact, I know for a young person of color than a middle-aged white person, right? Like the answers are different. But I think at bottom, where I've seen really successful movements and people plugging into movements, I think the success of those movements are largely due to people gravitating, because there's no end to issues out there. That I promise you, if there is a societal problem, if there's an anti-racist, anti-woman, like whatever it is, there is a movement for you out there, right? I think that what, as someone who's been in multiple movements myself, the movements that I have felt that have been most successful for me and for themselves are those movements where my heart is pulling me to it, that I have something to contribute of value, and that I am valued in that. So those like the three kind of things, right? You have to be driven by your heart. You have to feel like you have something to contribute. And trust me, everybody's got something to contribute when it comes to a political campaign. And I mean that small p. I don't mean that like, you know, ranked choice voting. That I'm talking about like Jared's talking about movement stuff, right? But you also have to be valued by whatever space you enter into movement-wise. You will only be as successful, and I challenge that movement, that movement will only be as successful as much as they make people feel valued and centered, right? And I'm sorry if I'm giving like an abstract response or an abstract question, but I think that for me, that's like an honest way that I would advise anyone looking to figure out like how to get into this kind of fight for the, spirit of this country, and frankly, forget the spirit of this country, man, for the survival of this world. I mean, we're talking about some, some basic survival issues, right? And again, multiple movements addressing all sorts of facets of that. And I would love to hear, other folks' responses to that.
Yeah. There's another question from Nala Amaru, and so we'll go to that question. And I just realized we're 20 minutes over our schedule. So let's take this question, and then I'll ask everybody for a 30-second wrap up, and then I'll close. Nala?
Hi, this is Nayela Amaru. I'm an honorary member of the Pratt Mafia, if you will. I am a proud alumna of the Hunter Urban Planning Program. Just a quick question. The concepts and practice of diversity, equity, inclusion have been brought up at different points throughout this conversation. But as a Black Indigenous woman student, especially in urban planning spaces here in New York City, I have learned that there are different interpretations and working definitions of what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean. From my own lived experiences, when I'm with well-meaning progressive white classmates. And so just really curious as to, as we're thinking about the structural reform and paradigm shifting of really, decolonizing, planning, architecture, design, because there are so few Black, Indigenous, and Brown people in the current spaces, and diversity, equity, inclusion are often understood and practiced through a white-centered lens, which can be harmful and exclusionary to Black, Indigenous, and Brown people and communities. I'm just curious as to possible solutions in the meantime, as we are building out this pipeline that is more inclusive, and so that we can have more conversations and perspectives of what diversity, equity, and inclusion really mean, truly rooted and centered in the experiences of historically marginalized communities and not centered on white people's experience. So I'm just curious as to what thoughts are as to how we can be more inclusive and purposeful when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and planning spaces. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments, closing comments from the panelists?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think to that, for some reason, I'm thinking of Audre Lorde, maybe because it's National Poetry Month, and I just was reconnecting with her. When she would speak, she would say, "I'm a Black lesbian poet, warrior, mother." So I think diversity is the answer to that question for me. Is we have to create spaces that allow people to voice all of their selves, because we're all complex people, and so that's and the other point I want to make is tied to the previous question about movements. And I am almost regretting that I started by saying we're all part of the system, because that's a point I came to later. I think it's the social movements that push systems, and I think it's social movements that define diversity in more meaningful ways, outside of the system, and then they bring to the system that knowledge or that political power to get that system to respond. And the last thing I want to say about political movements is the big change last year was because of a movement called Black Lives Matter that grew exponentially as a result of one person filming an act. So we saw a political movement that had been churning along for years. Suddenly, that framework was embraced by millions, and there were protests in like thousands of cities, fueled by that movement. That's then today pushing for police reform, which, yes, we're not there yet, but it was that movement that then enveloped the pressure on the policing system. So that's my last thoughts.
Okay. Tiffany, do you want to chime in for the last time, or?
Sure, thank you. That was a really big question. And admittedly, I don't know that I have a big enough answer. But I think two things that are important. I think that when we are talking about inclusivity, it's important that we always recognize and admit out loud that definitions change. And we should recognize when we are speaking from points of privilege and allow for the flexibility in being able to reverse that. And I think that when we talk about being purposeful, that we also, and the we is either an institution or it's a person, that although we are doing work that is purposeful, that we also make sure that we are not getting defensive when those who feel as though they are not getting the support and the resources that they need are asking for more than what is given.
Thank you. Travis, last word.
I would say my final comments is I would expect that diversity would have a diverse set of definitions. I think the beauty of diversity is that it is just that. I think it was James Wines, the great architect, who said, I like diversity because the other way is just so boring, right? My opinion is that I would love to see someone else's studio, and I would love to go to them and see what they're doing and then share what I'm doing, as opposed to us trying to figure out a way to do it. Look at many different ways that it's doing, because again, look at the energy in this room and how creative all of us are. And when we start to actually talk about how we would get there, that's when you're going to see the difference. And oftentimes that's used as a division. So my answer to the young lady is, do your thing. You know, think about it and bring something forward and share it in the place of diversity, of collaboration. And all of us, with respect towards one another, and again, a real definition and focus and point of view on what we're doing, we should actually bring it forth.
Well, the hour is late, and I want to thank everybody for this amazing discussion, and thank you all for the time and the commitment and the audience that stayed with us to the very end of the day. And so, Tiffany, Sean, Jack, Eddie, it was great, and it was a great, I think, a great series, and one that has left us with an agenda that we really have to adhere to and continue in the months and years to come. Is Courtney still around? Because I had asked her to make an announcement about next Tuesday. I don't think she is.
I'm in her class, so I could share the
Okay.
flyer. Give me one second.
For those that are remaining, there will be another panel discussion this coming Tuesday.
Mhm.
And we'll stay on for a moment and we'll post. I think it'll come up. I don't have the information with me.
James, you can go ahead and share it, what you just sent to me.
Suspense is killing me.
Sorry.
Whoa, this is awesome. I'm sorry. I did not expect this. I'm so glad I waited for this. Please, somebody tell us what this is. This is wonderful. I love it.
Wow.
There will
James,
be.
go for it.
Go ahead. You do it.
Me? Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is James. I'm a planning student with Ameren. We're in a class called Abolitionist Approaches to Social Planning, and we'll be having a roundtable on Tuesday with a bunch of incredible practitioners across the country coming together to discuss an abolitionist approach to planning, but also Afrofuturism, and how that intersects place, race, collective freedoms. Yeah, there's a flyer. I just posted the link in the chat, so please come through. It'll be a very fascinating conversation, I think,
Yeah,
and very interactive as well.
Please join that event. I think it'll be very informative, and it continues in a different light as some of the things we discussed today. I want to thank everybody and thank all of you. And I want to thank Eddie for sharing the burden of running this series. It has been really delightful, and I think an important set of discussions over the last few months, and hopefully we'll produce something as a result of it. Thank you all. And you can all leave now.
Thank you, Ron. Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, Ron and Eddie.